Thanks so much, Antonia. What a introduction. I realized I did a sort of university challenge kind of wave there, which is a bit strange, but I quite liked it. I think I might keep that in. So Antonia's just done a really good introduction for us, but essentially today we're looking at information and case studies. We may do a kind of breakout room and we're going to ask you to get quite involved in the chat. It'd be really helpful to kind of get as much feedback from you as possible. And then there's always time for questions throughout and then at the end. I've put up just a quick slide about our why. This really just summarizes all of the research that we did before setting up Flexible Teacher Talent, which is an organization which helps schools to become more flexible, and it also helps individuals to request more flexibility. And I'm going to very briefly talk through the stats. So in the bottom right corner is the key one, which is about getting people in front of students. So our real why is ensuring that as much as possible we have effective teachers in front of the students that we're serving. And the Sutton Trust report from 2011 just said, you know, far and away, the biggest impact on our pupils, particularly our more vulnerable pupils, is having effective teaching in the classroom. And that's why we're here. And that's why you're here, because you want to remain in a profession that, you know, that you love. We are also here because we were, or Lindsay and I, who co-founded Flexible Teacher Talent with me, we were at risk of being one of the kind of 6,000 women aged 30 to 39 who are leaving each year. And Emma may talk a little bit later about the research that went, the only research really that has gone into why those people are leaving. And it's very possible, I'm assuming, and I'm going to make an assumption, but I'm going to ask you to put in the chat in a minute, whether you are kind of part of that demographic of people that are kind of consider or would leave teaching if there isn't a bit more of an element of flexibility. I'll also talk about just the leadership diversity. So while Pioneer has Antonia co-CEO with Eddie, our leadership picture is not particularly great in terms of proportion. So if we're a 70% female workforce, that is not reflected in our senior leadership. Obviously, flexible working isn't a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of these problems, but it is one way of retaining effective teachers in the classroom and kind of helping balance out that leadership diversity, at least in the situation which we currently are, which is where the majority of childcare does fall to women. And of course, the pandemic has had a bit of a shift. And so we're kind of seeing more and more a change in the people who are coming to these sessions. So it did very much used to be, you know, just kind of for mums. But the more we've done research into flexible working, the more we realise that the more available it is to everybody, then the better it is for the organisation and for the individuals. If we're relying on one or two people who are, you know, possibly stretched as carers for both their children, possibly their parents at the same time, sandwich carers, to try and prove that flexible working works, then we find that it isn't always a particularly successful model. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we want schools to be a bit more proactive in that. So using the chat function, I've just kind of put up a bit of like kind of housekeeping really. So just feel free to put questions throughout. It would be really great when we can share kind of stories of success. So yourself, colleagues, any wider networks, things that you know have worked. If you have any kind of request or if you missed a detail, you need us to repeat anything, then please let us know. But let's kind of obviously keep anonymity where that is the kind of professional thing to do. So it may be that we're sharing success stories, but if there's something that's gone wrong, or if there's an organisation that hasn't maybe fulfilled what you required from your flexible working, then it would be great if we can keep that kind of anonymous. So why are we talking about flexible working? I know that you're here because you want to make those requests, and it's quite important really to be as equipped as possible when you're going to kind of make that request. In an ideal scenario, you will be in an organisation where there's kind of open communication up until the point where you make the request, excuse me. And at that point, it's really a kind of rubber stamp, having thrashed out the details. I have been on a couple of appeals recently, And it's really telling that in the appeals process, that's where, you know, the details are kind of being thrashed out. And if it's getting to that point, then it isn't really a process that's working particularly well. And so it's quite important that you know not just kind of what the benefits are going to be to you, but in terms of the organization, so that when it comes to that meeting, that first meeting, in the formal process, that you're able to really sell, you're really able to sell that. So this is from 2012, and these statistics have kind of improved, or have changed rapidly since kind of COVID. And this is from obviously other sectors apart from education. So we're talking about productivity being an improvement in all other sectors. And when we talk about schools, I guess our productivity is really the outcomes for our pupils. We can't yet make a direct link between having flexible working in schools and there being an increase in pupil outcomes. Schools are quite complex places, so working out, you know, the input and then that specific output is quite difficult. But we do have somebody working on an MA who presented yesterday about how job shares had an impact on specifically data in primary school students, so the outcomes of those primary school students. And we're looking to kind of support and encourage research in this area. So if after this webinar you then kind of go away and do a flexible working request, our data set, the larger data set that we can get, do keep in touch with us and let us know how you're getting on, because the more information we can get about how flexible working is affecting productivity, then the better. So the second reason that wasn't initially anything that I really understood or knew about or sold as a reason for flexibility is in terms of the kind of mature skills that an organization has when it offers flexibility to its workers. So this comes from a report done by MIT, and they're talking about the kind of mature skills that an organization has, which is represented by offering flexibility to your staff. I'm not going to read the statistics to you, but the idea that by offering flexibility, you're demonstrating a huge amount of trust to your workers means that they then are able to repay you with loyalty. People who are trusted feel empowered, they remain loyal, they offer an awful lot more to the organization, and then when we start to look at the benefits, we start to see that you're able to retain them for longer. In these kind of November dark days, it's not hard to see how this kind of trust really helps to keep kind of well-being, which is a term that gets kind of bandied around a lot and is sometimes really well resourced, and sometimes it's just kind of a well-being week with a bit of yoga. So whatever that means in your organization, flexible working, if offered to everyone and then done kind of with a parity of process, is something which can really genuinely build, you know, a kind of genuine trust from employees to employers. And the organizations who take it on find that this is something that kind of has such a kind of positive impact on every other area of their life. I've put this on because, again, it's kind of statistics that are relevant to people who are looking to work flexibly and then don't. So we've talked about the kind of second biggest group of people who are leaving, so women aged 30 to 39. The biggest group is retirees. And this report by the ENFA in 2019 is incredibly helpful. We always kind of support everything that the ENFA says, usually because it's something that we've heard anecdotally, and then the ENFA come and write a beautiful report full of beautiful, you know, graphs that really back up everything that we've heard anecdotally. So one of the key things that the graph on the right-hand side shows you is that when people are leaving, when the specific group of women aged 30 to 39 are leaving, they are they're going on to either reduce their kind of level of seniority. So they're either leaving, they're staying in teaching, but they're going into a role which is lower than their level of kind of seniority. So maybe they're stepping down from a teacher to a teaching assistant, or they're relinquishing their TLR, or they're no longer working as a senior leader. The second thing that it shows is that once people are leaving the profession entirely, it's flexibility that they were looking for. So 4 years after they've left the profession, it's flexible. It's a flexible role that they're in, which suggests that that's what they were looking for, and that's what they were unable to kind of get hold of in our profession. So it's really important in terms of retaining 1 or 2 individuals in the school, and I'm assuming because you're here, you're one of those people that's wanting to make that kind of request. But in terms of the profession as a whole, it's quite good to have that idea of statistics, because we're hemorrhaging talent and we can't afford to. And if we think about the benefits of having people who've worked in the profession, who need a bit of flexibility at a certain point in their role, we're never going to, it's very unlikely that anybody is going to be able to afford or want to work flexibly for the entirety of their life. But having a bit of flexibility at certain points in your working life can make teaching a sustainable career. And the final thing to say on that is there's a wealth of experience in head teachers and senior leaders who are close to retirement. And if we're losing those people because maybe they just feel like they can't put in the hours, but they would have maybe remained in the profession for a couple more years if they were able to have a bit of flexibility, maybe doing a co-headship with somebody coming in who's new, then that can be a huge benefit to not just them personally because they're able to ease into retirement, but to the school that retains their wealth of experience. And I give an example of a head of sixth form who had been at the school for a very long time, had really successful outcomes for students going on to higher education, and she was ready to kind of leave, but is now doing a successful kind of talent partnership, which is the wording that we use for job share, with somebody who was less experienced but who was ready to make the jump up to the head of sixth form. And so that sixth form in Leicestershire are kind of working as a co-headship. They've continued for 2 years, and the more senior member, or the kind of more experienced member of the sixth form, is like very open about how helpful it has been to ease into her retirement, how wonderful it's been to be able to pass on her experience that wouldn't have been able to be done, you know, in a kind of one pager of A4 handing over to your to whoever's coming in after you. And it's kind of over that year of time where you're looking after those sixth formers that all of that knowledge and wisdom is kind of imparted. And so the organisation doesn't lose any of that. So we're keeping a lot of people. Emma, before I move on, is there anything else that you would add about retaining staff and how beneficial that is to the organisation?
Yeah, so thanks, Lucy. It's always really, really interesting to hear some of the stuff that Flexible Teacher Talent know and work on, and the anecdotes that you have that matches up with the data. For those of you who aren't familiar with the MTPT project, we do specifically deal with a parent demographic, predominantly mothers. But the research that we've been doing into this demographic of women aged 30 to 39 who have left teaching, and also those who have stayed in teaching, a lot of the findings that we have from that particular demographic are very relevant to the larger groups of teachers or different demographics that we find under strain and we find are at risk of attrition. So something that we hear a lot from both mothers and teachers who are 5 years into their career is this idea of stress, burnout, poor mental health, and we know that there's the 5-year attrition rate for younger or less experienced teachers, and actually where teachers have been able to negotiate flexible working in that 30 to 39 age bracket, it has been the thing that has enabled them that space to breathe, to manage feelings of overwhelm, or to manage the other things in their life that create that feeling of overwhelm. But I think we're still seeing this assumption that younger teachers, or maybe teachers who don't have additional caring responsibilities or a clear-cut reason, some very clear evidence to request flexible working, wouldn't necessarily consider that an option for them. And actually there are lots of 25, 26, 27-year-olds who would probably benefit from a 4-day week to manage the rest of their lives, to enjoy their youth whilst they've got it, before they fall into that bracket of becoming carers. And so I think the more that we can make flexible working an option as early as possible for whoever it is that wants it, the more likely we're likely to see a sustainable growth from our trainees all the way through the workforce. I think what we've noticed as well, particularly with the impact of COVID, is far more fathers looking at flexible working and actually saying enough is enough. These are my priorities, and a lot more of the discussions that we would normally associate with mothers in terms of their priorities, their values, associated with what they really want to be doing with their time, and that's not actually working all hours of the day. And there's a lot of research around working patterns for millennial workers who are sort of now in their 30s, mid-30s and 40s, who actually they demand more from their companies, and they demand more for their personal lives and their well-being. So I think that's just something that's reflected, that has sort of come to me as you've been talking there. And also the comment that we can't directly make this link between flexible working and improved student outcomes, or ask the question, what impact does it have on student outcomes? But there are studies done on teacher well-being, how that impacts student outcomes. So where we're having happier teachers, we're seeing calmer students, we're seeing better behaviour, we're seeing sort of more stable progression with students, and we're seeing better outcomes. I'll pop some links in the chat there. So there's that sort of indirect link that if flexible working is one way to improve the well-being or the mental health or the happiness of our staff workplace, then having a school full of happy teachers is going to have a bit bigger impact, or a better impact on our students, than a school full of stressed, burnt out teachers at crisis point.
Thanks, Emma, so much. And I'm just looking at the point that Antonia has made, which is not asking the reasons for wanting to work flexibly as part of our flexible job design process. And when we're working with schools, I think it is really important, before a school begins, we sort of talk to them about what is it that you're going to offer. And it might be that you're going to distinguish the kind of contractual, either part-time job share or a full-time post, with a genuine kind of flexi culture. And that kind of flexi culture is going to include things like, I would like to have a staggered start, so I want to come in later, or one time a week I want to go to a music festival. And that for those teachers, whether it's taking your child to school or going to the music festival, those are kind of parity in terms of importance to their well-being. And so as a school, there needs to be this kind of move away, or as a leadership team, there needs to be a decision to move away from kind of making a judgment based on what the event is. And I think that's something that schools who are doing this really well, they're asking everyone and what they would require, but they're not asking the reason why. And I think that becomes really helpful in terms of people seeing there being like a kind of equity. So not necessarily all having the same arrangement, but being able to ask for something regardless of what the reason for the arrangement is. So really briefly about recruitment, I know that Mandy Coulter is going to talk about it, but if you are looking for a role, more and more schools are kind of recognizing that putting some kind of flexible wording on an advert is helpful. It is, from their point of view, they get about 17% more applicants. I'm going to assume that that's gone up. That's a figure from 2019, so I'm going to assume that's going to have gone up. And when we talk to kind of senior leaders, the idea is that putting some wording in is going to increase their field. If you're already working in a school, it's likely, based on the culture of the school that you're in, that an internal advert or an advert for something that you're going for, or if you're just trying to change your working pattern, you're going to have an idea about the kind of adverts that go out from your school. So if you know that this isn't the norm, or it isn't kind of the way that you do things in your school, then it may be that you're kind of already anxious about even going for a role or requesting flexible working for the role that you're in. We do know that that's one of the biggest things that actually stops this kind of flexible drive, is people not even asking. And I recognise that often it isn't until we're quite vulnerable that we're having to make this request. So you're often asking people who are the most tired to kind of suddenly go through a process that they hadn't possibly considered before. But simply because it doesn't happen in your school yet shouldn't be a reason not to attempt a trial. And we'll talk a little bit about how you might do that. The other reason to kind of go for it is that, you know, the big three, so Ofsted, the National Association of Head Teachers, and the NGA, so the National Governance Association, all, you know, support it. So as well as the DFE strategy to use flexible working to help their recruitment and retention strategy, then we've also got kind of these, you know, organisations who are there to support schools, who are like putting their hat in the ring and saying, like, this is something that we support. So it may be that your head teacher is one of the barriers, but the NAHT does support flexible working. So getting some support from there. The other thing is that governors are often people who work in other sectors, and school and education is about 30 years. I think COVID might have pushed it up a little bit. We're about 30 years and about behind other sectors in terms of flexible working. So if your governors are people who are from outside the sector, then it's very worthwhile kind of sounding out the governors and finding out whether they're really aware of how inflexible working in a school can sometimes be. So over to you. Why do you want to work flexibly, and what would be the benefit to you and your school? I guess this is a point where we can put things in the chat, or I can unmute people and share. I can kind of, while you're sort of thinking about it, mine is a kind of classic reason. So I wanted to work flexibly because I had 2 young children and I was an assistant head teacher, and I wanted to kind of just continue that. And I was sort of surprised that there wasn't a kind of job share platform like there is for the civil service. I thought it was something that would kind of exist already. I'm very glad that the Shared Headship Network are doing what they're doing, and I know there's quite a lot of co-head teachers, more than there were even when we began this work, and even kind of people interviewing together. So there's a kind of shift and a movement towards having co-leadership. But that's kind of the reason why I was looking for it. At the moment, obviously, I work flexibly, so I teach 3 days a week, and the rest of the time I'm working with flexible teacher talent and helping schools to become more flexible. Is there anyone, and I don't know, is there anyone who wants to share why they want to work flexibly and what the benefit to them would be? Okay, I'm going to say this is more of a, oh yeah.
Okay. I was just going to say that after the last few years with COVID, you know, and it helps you to kind of like, I guess, reassess what you're thinking and what you're doing. And last summer, I asked our trust board whether it would be possible for me to trial flexible working for a year to see whether it worked for me and whether it worked for the organisation, and they granted that. And the reason that I wanted to do that was that I wanted to undertake some study. So I've, you know, started a programme of study at the same time, so I have one day to be able to work on that, and we looked at how we could, you know, ensure the capacity within to make sure that everything could happen. But they were incredibly supportive in that request to work flexibly. So I'm not sure whether that, you know, opens things up in terms of, you know, thinking about, I've got 2 young children, but they're now slightly older, but actually it was thinking about pursuing other, you know, hobbies and interests and actually studying. So I don't know whether that's useful to anybody.
I'll jump in as well. But I worked full time after both of my maternity leaves with them, and part of that was financial reasons. We lived in London, we needed to pay our rent and our childcare, and actually we needed a full-time income. But when things started to ease up with our childcare bills and our oldest got to school, there was actually opportunity for me to take a little bit of a financial step back and use flexible working to pursue the growth of the MTPT project. But I did find actually that I did get caught in the assumption from a lot of people that the reason that I was working or asking to work part-time or flexibly was to spend more time with my children. when that wasn't the case because they were in childcare. And actually my son kept going to breakfast club on the day that I was not at school. So for me, it was about developing the side project, the network, the anti-future project, and dedicating time to that after it had grown to a point where I couldn't balance it the weekend at the evenings.
Thank you both. And I guess like this is a sort of piece to have, and you probably have thought about it already, but just, you know, it's about having real clarity about what it is that you want to have from it. And I suppose the biggest trap that sometimes people fall into is wanting to work flexibly because they're not able to fill or not able to complete their workload in the time that's allocated, and we would always advise against that. So if it's a kind of workload issue, if it's unable, or if people are taking flexible working so that they're then using those extra days to kind of catch up on schoolwork, then really that needs to be a wider conversation in your organisation and with your line manager about what it is about that particular role that is, you know, unmanageable within the hours. We know obviously teachers always go over and above. We know, you know, in studies that with nurses, police, similar kind of caring roles that we would, you know, far outweigh overtime. But if you're taking a flexible role because you're unable to complete anything and you know that you'd be using that day to catch up, then that's something that probably you would want to avoid, and you want to try and make sure that as far as possible you're getting that work done kind of within your allocated time. But having an idea about what would benefit you personally, but then your pupils and of course the organisation is really key to kind of a successful request, because it's one of the kind of main drivers. We've talked a little bit about I've said a little bit about how we advise schools. And so I've put at the top this kind of proactive versus reactive model. I think it's fair to say that most schools at the moment, not Pioneer Trust, but most schools are a reactive model. So they're they're kind of waiting on individual requests coming in, and then the kind of normal statutory process is followed. There are some schools who follow a proactive model, and this is what it looks like is kind of in November or end of October, staff will all be asked, so each member of staff will be asked what kind of flexibility they're after, and the school may well have been very specific about the types of flexibility that it can offer. So it may have looked at its commitments and said, you know, we offer huge, we want to have like parental contact, that's one of our organisational priorities. So we're not going to be able to let our teachers leave early at the end of the day because we want to have that parental contact at the gate if we're a primary school, but we can offer other types of flexibility. You know, your organisational priority might be that you're focusing on your literacy strategy. If you're doing that at secondary, then you're going to need some very specific teachers who are going to deliver that, you know, on a daily basis. And so you might not be able to offer whole days off, but you would be able to kind of offer staggered hours. So as an organisation, they need to think about the kind of flexibility they can offer. Are you going to say that your teachers can walk out at the end of the day with pupils? Is there going to be stigma attached to that? All of those kind of things. But once that's organised, and once as an organisation you've decided, then the dream, and I guess what we're pushing for and moving towards and hoping will happen, is that schools will become a place where in October, November time, all members of staff are asked what kind of flexibility they're after. Not necessarily the reason for that flexibility, but where communication is good and where people are able to talk about reasons, then that can help the timetabler. So the more they know about the situation, or the more they're able to come back to you and say, you know, is it that specific day? Is it, you know, is it specific that it needs to be in the morning, or could it be in the afternoon? Excuse me. Whatever those things are, then this process is kind of finished. There's a bit of toing and froing, and then by March or April, the school has a kind of really clear idea about the skills audit, where they need to advertise for posts, and who they're able to offer flexibility to. You probably aren't going to be able to change what your school is doing if you're kind of an individual
making a request. But if you're a school leader, having a look at this kind of proactive model can actually save you an awful lot of time. If you've already done some of these, then sorry, I'm just going to have a moment. I have some water. Rather than having
2 or 3 kind of individual requests coming in, having to set up the meetings. If as a senior leadership team, you're being much more proactive, then this kind of process can be really speedy. And it's something that doesn't need to take nearly any time. You might also have seen that the DfE have got a consultation at the moment, which is looking at pushing all employees to be able to make requests from day one. So at the moment, you have to work for an organisation for 26 weeks, but the consultation will allow all members of staff to ask from day one. And it also will allow for multiple requests within the 12 months. So if you're not using a proactive model at the moment, then it's something that organisations might want to consider, so that they're not kind of bombarded by numerous different requests throughout the year. They can actually kind of manage that. I've put, some of the benefits of the proactive model, and Emma kind of alluded that sometimes it's not an immediate, it's not so easy to see the output. Or I said it wasn't easy to see the output, but there is almost immediate reaction in sick leave, cost for cover, staff turnover, and those things are all linked to the well-being, which obviously has an impact on your pupils, sustained and over time. So this is something that you can consider, but if flexible working was available to everyone, think about how that might help you. So obviously when you're making your own individual request, if you're still working with the reactive model, then you might not be able to affect kind of organizational change. But it's something to bear in mind. If you're asking for a kind of part-time or a job share role, which is a contractual idea, rather than a kind of very simple tweak to your week, which will make things easier, then maybe start to think about, is it something that just I need, or is it something that as an organization we might push forward, and what kind of benefits there might be to your school. I'm going to talk about the kind of law quite briefly, because I think once people are on the process of putting in a statutory request, then you are kind of aware of the law and the regulations. But essentially, 2014 is always cited as the time when everybody was allowed it. The more research we've done, these earlier dates come up. So actually parents have been able to ask for flexible working since 1996. And I guess with the sort of various governments and work regulations, things have sort of changed. But that law from 2014 just means that from week 26 of your employment, you can make one request in a 12-month period. And we do work with some schools who allow more than one request in the 12 months. And there are, but there are very few at the moment who would allow it from the beginning of a contract. What we do say to people who are going for a role, and I know that Emma has already done a session with people who are kind of returning to the profession, and this goes for if you're looking for roles outside of your current organisation. Our current advice, if you're going for a role and you cannot find one which is advertised flexibly, is firstly to do some like real blue sky thinking about what you're after. And once you've done that, you're really going to come down to about 2 or 3 schools within a certain radius from your house, and you're looking for a very specific role. And if that role comes up and it's not advertised flexibly, then our advice is to go for the role. Because of the homework that you've done, you're very likely to be then offered the job, and it's at that time that you would negotiate flexibility. So although flexibility isn't offered from day one under the law, if you went for a role and were offered it, there is a kind of opportunity for negotiating. Clearly it isn't ideal. I know a lot of people feel, and I think women particularly feel bad about the idea that you might be wasting somebody's time by going for an interview when you know you're going to be requesting flexibility. But I think organisations who see in you, the expertise and the value that you're going to add will probably be sensible enough to kind of to at least have that conversation. And I think more and more schools will have to accept that if they're not offering flexibility from the outset, so from the recruitment process, that it's something that's going to come up. Not only from people who are kind of having caring responsibilities, but like Emma said, we've got 93% of people aged 18 to 24 are going to ask for flexibility regardless of the sector. And I think we have to kind of assume that we're going to include education in that. So it's more and more going to be something that's just requested as standard.
And I just jump in there as well, Lucy, I think in teaching, we can often get ourselves into a bit of a mindset of not being allowed things or not being permitted to do certain things. And when you sort of read texts or talk to colleagues, friends who are in other sectors, negotiating things like working hours, working patterns, benefits, bonuses, that sort of thing, travel expensive, that is part of the application and the interview process and the back and forwards between a job offer. I think far too often as teachers, when we apply for roles, we think we have to take what we're given because we're very lucky to get the job. But actually having that empowered conversation of, yes, I would like this role, I would also like these things, and beginning that negotiation process, and not necessarily feeling, taking it personally if those things are denied, but making sure that the school are aware of what your non-negotiables are. That's something that happens in other industries that somehow hasn't quite translated over into education, where we sort of almost don't want to bite the hand that feeds us.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you make about not wanting to kind of break the rules. And I was listening to an assistant head teacher in a school who'd taken on flexibility as her role, and that school has deliberately made a choice to have a difference between a contractual request, so to work specifically part-time or as a job share or full-time, and then to have just kind of like a flexi culture. And she said that it was very difficult initially to actually get teachers to believe that they were allowed, on the day when their PPA time was in their final lesson, they were actually allowed to leave early if they didn't have any other commitments. And it took kind of almost like writing it in the policy, sharing it with everybody, but then modeling it, you know, as a leader. So the head teacher kind of had been given a complimentary lunch and a sort of Michelin star, and had to model that he was going to then use that. So that, and that was what really kind of kick-started other teachers saying, okay, but there's this kind of not, you know, it's too good to be true. And unless we know the rules, you know, we might not, we need to be really clear on what we're allowed and what we're not allowed. And I think, you know, there's a lot of unhelpful narratives that we have in teaching, and that is one of them. And then the other one, which kind of stops flexibility working, is this kind of presenteeism. So being in the building is more important than, you know, being effective, essentially. And whether, you know, it's effective, I'm working particularly with a school at the moment where the core hours are 8 until 5. And, you know, I guess the biggest gripe from the teachers is, if I'm working here from, you know, if I've got a 6-period day, I'm just not effective between 3:30 and 5. So why am I being kind of held here? And it comes back to that same kind of trust. So with flexibility and the law, just to go back to it. So it's really important that the request process and decision making is clear. And I think that the more information you can get from the organisation about what their policy is, the more you can talk to people in advance of making the flexible working request, the better. And it may be that you have a conversation with your line manager, and it may be you have a conversation with your head teacher even, and the feedback is, well, I mean, you can do the application, but, you know, I'm not sure that we'll be able to entertain it. But yes, let's go through the process. And at that point, I think you have to not be downhearted. What I would do there is get as much information as possible. So it's quite easy to walk away from those conversations and just think, oh, okay, that's it. They're not, you know, they're not entertaining it. I don't know if I'm going to bother. But it's at that point, it's kind of that hinge question. Oh, that's interesting. Why is it that you wouldn't have gone for it? You know, and to kind of, and a bit as much as you can, interrogate what the barriers are, because we do know, and I'm going to talk about barriers in a minute, but the biggest barrier to whether a school is going to adopt flexible working is the opinion of the head teacher. So regardless of all the other logistics. So if you can find out, or if you can ascertain, like, what is it about it that's really stopping you from making this move, then that can be a kind of real, it's a game changer when it comes to your putting your application to them, because it may be that it's simply, we had a job share in the past and it didn't work. And so then your homework is to go away and say, what is it about job shares that don't work? And it's just about planning, essentially. It's about making sure that the people who are doing the job share share values, as opposed to they just both happen to come back from maternity leave at the same time, and therefore they're going to be lumped together. So if you can the more you can interrogate what the barrier is and what the reason is, and the more information you can find out about how the role or how your role could be done, the more you know your role inside out. So the more you could talk about your TLR and how it could be shared out between people in your team, the more you can kind of come with the sort of solutions, the better. And I guess a variety of solutions and being flexible about those solutions is quite important. The wording that's put on the statutory request is that it has to be dealt with in a reasonable manner. And I think probably one of the biggest sort of like the most negative feedback is that people feel that it isn't dealt with. You know, they feel like it was a sort of fait accompli, that they went through the process, that the school went through the motions, but essentially they were always going to say no. And it is quite hard to argue against that once it's over. So I guess we would talk about the kind of things that you can do to ensure that it does, get conducted in a reasonable manner. And one of the things is having those conversations in advance, requesting to have somebody with you in the meeting. And that can be, it might be a family member, it might be a friend, it might be another colleague. Usually that person is not really allowed, they're not allowed to speak for you, but simply having somebody in there with you for that process can be just kind of really strengthening. And it's just this kind of support that allows you to ensure that the process is reasonable, and also to come away from it and have somebody else who was in that room, because oftentimes people are quite, understandably sort of emotionally invested in these decisions that are going to be made. And so you may walk away and think that the meeting didn't go as well, or you may have, it's not that you're going to have misunderstood what's happening, but the more you can have a kind of objective viewpoint of somebody who is there with you, the better. And Tonya, you put up your hand, or Pioneer have raised their hand. Sorry. Hi there.
Hiya, yes, not Antonio, it's me. Hiya. I was just listening to obviously what you were saying there about approaching and doing some research, and obviously looking at how your role can be divvied up. Forgive me, it sounded quite formal in terms of make sure somebody's in the room with you, make sure you research. What's the best way, would you say, to approach the conversation in the first instance, without the formality of it, to sort of ensure a successful opening of the conversation and to get the dialogue going two ways, I suppose? It's just, as someone who would be looking to make the requests and who doesn't ever approve flexible working, I was just wondering from that perspective how you would begin to approach it.
So I guess the first thing is to say, don't concern yourself with precedent. So deal with kind of the facts. So if there's a feeling that, oh, it won't be, I'm not going to be listened to, or it's not going to be approved, that isn't very helpful in the process. What's really helpful is looking at the facts. What is your school's flexible working policies? Some schools have a kind of out of the box from the local authority or from their MAT, but some have kind of done quite a bit of work to tweak it. So in some flexible working policies, there's actually, a bit of informal conversation with your line manager in advance of doing it. If that doesn't exist, so if there isn't any informal chat, I would advise that people do that as much as possible. It may be that your line managers are not equipped to answer those questions. It may be that people send you straight to SLT and to the top. And when we work with schools, and this isn't very helpful to you kind of your individual organisation, but it's the more work that we can do with middle managers and senior leaders, the better. Because the more your middle managers, and your middle managers know what the priorities of the school are, and they know what they need to achieve, and they know what skills they have in their department. So the more you're able to kind of talk with them about how you view that role working, and whether they can see kind of scope for it, the better. Because it may be that you kind of, I think, and I don't want to always talk about mothers and parents, but we are oftentimes up at 2 and 4 in the morning thinking about the dream scenario where if I go back to work, this is exactly how I'm going to make it work. And then there's going to be 1 or 2 obstacles that are going to stop you from doing that because you just haven't considered from somebody else's point of view. So the more conversations you can have with line managers, the better. Appreciate if you're off on maternity leave, that can be quite hard. And if you're not in a school where communication is open, then again, it's not going to work. And which is why, you know, more and more advocate if it's available to everybody. I think the other thing is to go away and find case studies where you've seen examples of where it's working already. So, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
Emma's going to answer a little bit more too.
I think as well, when it comes to the informal chat, it's highly likely that there would have been other conversations that would have preceded the, I'm thinking of making a flexible working request. So if I think anecdotally, I'm thinking of a colleague, if he came to me and said, I'm thinking of requesting flexible working, I would already know, or I hope I would already know, that that's because he's having a hard time with his workload and he's not feeling very motivated, and he is maybe suffering a little bit because some of his best friend colleagues have maybe left that year, and so the energy around his role is gone, and he's actually looking for a way to stick with it because he knows that maybe this is a phase and not quit entirely, and maybe flexible working is that. But before he says to me, Emma, I'm thinking of making a flexible working request, it's likely that I probably already know that context.
Yeah.
So I think that if that communication hasn't been there initially, there might be the opening up the conversation around honestly how you're feeling or what is going on in other parts of your life. So if it's a question of, I'm really excited that I've seen this course come up, this master's course, and I really want to do it, you know, that's going to precede. And by the way, I think flexible working would help with that. Would you say that
there's a higher success rate, or there's a higher ability to complete the process successfully if you have the open dialogue with managers and foresight prior to sort of going into the formal route? Is that what I'm hearing?
I think that would entirely depend on your relationship to your line managers.
Okay.
Because I think one of the dangers there, and what I would really encourage people to sort of stick to their guns with, is if that informal conversation happens, it's not you're within your 12-month sort of period until you put it in writing or until you fill in the form from your school. But if, for example, your line manager goes, why do you want to do that? You don't need flexible working. Why would you let the team down like that? That would be so difficult to timetable. I can't believe you would even mention that.
Oh, wow.
And that's going to be immediately very off-putting. And for some people, they would go, oh God, well, I won't put my flexible working request in. So if that's the reaction that some people are met with, again, my encouragement would be stick to your guns, but like Lucy said about requesting the interview feedback, objectively as possible, delve into that panic or that resistance, or and you know, so that you can say, okay, well, I am going to put my flexible working request in. I understand that these are your concerns. I'm going to go away and think about how we can mitigate them if my flexible working request is approved.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It's interesting just from a requester's perspective to think about. I wouldn't, within my context, I wouldn't imagine having the negative reactions that you have talked about. So I'm also more intrigued, but maybe not in this forum, to understand if that's something that you have seen a lot in schools. I know it's not something I've seen within our schools. So yeah, I'm just sort of trying to grasp that reaction. It's quite foreign to me, but thank you. That's actually really, really helpful. Thank you.
I'm glad it's helpful. I think it is really true. I mean, I don't think you can underestimate how much further forward Pioneer is than other schools, and genuinely. So if I'm looking at like our inbox from today, you know, there are people who are saying, I want to put this request in, but I'm not sure because, you know, and it's a lot of the time it's kind of coaching people to say, well, what are the facts? You know, yes, you might not want to, somebody else's might have been denied last time, but let's look at the reality. You know, also things have come on leaps and bounds, you know, and there's a sort of, as much as there is not much silver lining for COVID, you know, schools overnight were able to do a lot of the things that they initially had said this is totally impossible.
Noted.
So remote meetings,
Yeah.
you know, suddenly were possible. And so there's an awful lot of things that I've been asked, you know, I've worked in a school and been asking to attend virtually the Monday briefing for a year. And they were, no, impossible. I don't know how you're going to do that. And yet there was Teams the whole time on everyone's computer, and kind of battered it away. So there are, you know, the difference in experience is vast, and context is really crucial. And I think, but I genuinely do think, as far as possible, it's kind of stick to the facts, use the law to help you. So you're not allowed to be discriminated against because people think you're going to ask for flexible working. You know, just because you've had a conversation doesn't mean you can then be sort of passed up for promotion or CPD opportunity. And that's kind of part of the Equalities Act. So having the informal conversation shouldn't, and of course we all know, you know, that's one of the fears. It's like, if I start asking for it, is that going to impact my professional development? Is it going to stop people from thinking that I'm committed? And I think that's one of the other things that we need to kind of change in the culture, is just because
I find that fascinating, because I've always worked on the assumption that a soft landing and a soft, like, to see the reaction in the first instance, sets you up for greater success rather than the left field hard formality in the moment. Because obviously, I mean, to use pregnancy as example, 9 months of people getting ready for the fact that you're going to be gone for, you know, 6, 9, 12 months, however long. But that soft landing of, this is what's happening now, this is what's going to be happening then. How do we sort of prepare for that? I've just assumed that approach was universal, I suppose.
It's so nice that you assume that, and I think as Lucy says, it speaks volume about the context that you're working in. Unfortunately, that it's just not the case for a lot of schools. But I do think if you have a positive working culture at your school, and you do have positive relationships, I absolutely agree with you there, that it sort of means that your line managers can sort of get their ducks in a row and go, right, this is how it would work, and if she does request, and that's how we would, or we might not be able to give her that, but we could give her that. So let's really like have a conversation, open up the dialogue, as you said. It can also, with the current law being with the 12-month period, it can also save you from wasting your shot, as it were. So I know, for example, in May 2019, I think, I requested flexible. I had the pre-conversation, warm conversation with my my head, and he said, why didn't you ask for this in January? There's no way that I can get this in for you for September. You know, I'm so for it, but it's just not going to happen with the timetable. And because I hadn't put anything in writing, because I just popped along for a chat, it meant that come September, I put my request in for the following year, and he was able to approve that because I hadn't already put a request in that year.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, ladies, thank you.
Oh, don't be sorry. And in fact, maybe this is the time to kind of have a sort of breakout.
I think it's just been really interesting to hear about the sort of will that is there to make flexible working work, and beyond it being a really good thing. I think it's understanding why school leaders want to make flexible working work, or why they don't, and coming back again to sort of probing when flexible working is denied, or when it's offered. What is it that's sort of motivating the school leader to offer that or to deny that, and maybe getting under the skin of that emotional hesitations or enthusiasm to actually look at practical strategies to address those barriers, or to harness that enthusiasm and find a purpose for that enthusiasm.
Yeah, I think similar, came across that there's kind of, your experiences shape you, don't they, particularly with school. And if I was listening to somebody the other day who said, we've always been in school, so often teachers kind of haven't been out in other organisations, and so your own experiences with the leaders that you have, and whether they're up for the kind of flexibility or not, can make like a real difference. when you're doing your application, I think it's really important. So sometimes it's not explicit in their policy. So the policy will be very dry, kind of stale document, which simply says, you know, this is the rules. Have you worked here by, 26 weeks? Can you offer, some explanation as to what's going to happen when you're not here? And I think rather than focusing on your reason for it, so although your reason is personal to you and it's important to know why you're requesting it, what's quite important, or what's sort of more important in terms of the organisation, is putting students at the heart. So how will what you're doing have an impact on them? And it may be that within that comes your reason. So, I really enjoy working here. I'm not going to leave if I don't have this flexible working request, but being able to leave earlier to or have my PPA time at this, at the end of the day, so that I can go to this yoga class, join my choir, go and be a session musician with this band, pick my children up from school, whatever the reason is, will improve my well-being and therefore have like a significant impact on the students that I teach. If it's a skills-based thing, then obviously, so if we've got kind of graphic designers who are wanting to be in the studio, or if we want people who are kind of bringing industry specialisms into school, then that's going to really help to put students at the heart. But I think the kind of your well-being is one of those things that puts students at the heart of your request. You will have already kind of thought about advantages and disadvantages, and I've talked about having a meeting with representation for your own sake, not so that somebody can watch, not so that somebody can monitor, your leadership or your head teacher, but just for to have somebody in the room with you can be kind of a real kind of stabling influence. I put the process takes no more than 3 months, and where possible, that should be, sped up. People are kind of at home. If it's a maternity request, you're often, this is kind of valuable time with your child that you're not going to get back, and you don't want to be wasting time worrying about it. And I think the more that you can be upfront about how quickly you want the process to take place or the reasons for it. And I say this having not spoken to people in the other rooms, but if this is passed on to leaders, particularly in instances where it's for a caring for a relative, for a parent, the reality is that that parent may be going into home, may not be around for a particularly long time, and so speeding up the process is essential, and having that extra bit of information is really important. So you're giving people a flexibility for quite a fixed amount of time, but the sooner that it happens, the better for their well-being. I'm just going to talk about types of flexibility, because I think sometimes we get caught just in part-time and job sharing. And so just very quickly to kind of give a few examples. And I've put the CIPD are the HR professional body. And so because of their definition, you can see why education is so far behind other sectors. So, we can't really change when we're client facing, and we can't change the location of the school. So that's why we're a little bit, we're further behind. We've talked about the context of your school and how important it is to know what it is you're looking for and whether your school can kind of offer that. And I talked a little bit earlier about, if you know your school quite well, so you know what their organisational priority is, what that then requires from you as a member of staff, and then what kind of commitment they might make in terms of flexibility. And I think if you're kind of a lone flexible working requester, having an idea about aligning your request with the organisation's priorities. So whatever the 5 kind of big things your head teachers kind of stood up and said at the beginning of the year, this is what we're doing, tying your flexible working request in with that, and choosing the right type of flexibility can be kind of key in terms of whether it's then accepted or denied. So PPA time all at once and off-site is something that's going to come in a lot more, I think, because it's been seen as something that's so much more possible since COVID. So there's, it isn't that the timetables will change, but it is that people can see that you can attend a meeting remotely. And if you don't have a learning family or a tutor time, and you don't have a period one, then is it really necessary for you to be in the building? Obviously, there's safeguarding, and you need sufficient adults in the building. But timetabling and being creative about timetabling is one thing that might change. But if timetablers can look at your timetable as it is and start to look about whether your PPA time can be done off site, then you're not really changing people's contractual obligations. And you're simply giving people a bit of time at a time in the week when they wouldn't have had to be sort of client facing. Staggered hours can be offered to people who are full-time or working flexibly already. So later starts, earlier finishes. Annualized hours is particularly useful for teachers who are drama teachers or music teachers who have that kind of big push for the Christmas show. So they're going to have to do, more hours over the whole year. And there's going to be like a point in the year when there are more of those. So they're doing longer days. And so there's a sort of recognition that there's going to be a total of hours. And if they're doing more just before Christmas, then is there something you can do once they have got exam classes in the summer? Is there something that you can do with Key Stage 3? Is there a kind of a move around of the timetable, so students are doing more art than music or something like that? So there's a way of kind of ensuring that somebody's annual hours are capped, but there's an acceptance that there's going to be more of those hours done at particular times of the year. Remote working was not, COVID was not a rehearsal for remote working in terms of schools, but a lot of people saw how there can be some benefit of not being in a school with the kind of shift of the lesson or students moving around, having to be on the corridor. So if you've got kind of a large piece of strategic work to complete, then working remotely and completing that off-site, just might be beneficial not just to you, but to the organisation. Personal days, I've just put a kind of really broad category. It's Christmas shopping days. It might be duvet days. Some schools have different names for them, but it's just any day that you're taking for sort of personal time. And then a temporary phased return. So this can be coming back from an illness. It may be coming back from bereavement. It may be, you have kind of had a broken leg or something like that, or somebody's coming back after a period of time away. And so the flexibility isn't actually permanent. So you're not required to have, you don't really need to make a statutory request. And that's where that kind of communication within your organisation is key. And then I put talent partnerships. So often with these things, the wording isn't very helpful. So the wording job shared just doesn't really sum up, the value of those arrangements. And so a talent partnership, changing the wording, changing the semantics can kind of help with how people view those things. I think in the breakout group, we thought about this and sort of we've had this conversation. So what type of flexibility would best suit you in your role? But also aligning it to your organisation. So take some time, like at the end of this session, or when you're kind of accessing the session, to make sure you've thought about not only what will suit you in your role, but also how does it align with the organisation. I'm going to really quickly go through the barriers. These are things that people will come up with. So often head teachers are worried that they're going to open the floodgates. I've already talked about how a proactive model is best, so offering it to everybody. But if you are having to offer solutions and you're having to try and share ways of your timetable working, often flexible workers get timetabled in last. Timetablers are not the enemy, but they have sometimes traditionally been sort of ivory tower and possibly the most kind of powerful person in an organisation. If you can suggest timetabling you in first, that's something that just doesn't often get considered, which is why people who are part-time workers might end up with sort of pieces of classes. But timetabling them first tends to be, from timetablers that I've spoken to and from what I know about timetabling, one of the best things, because it helps to ensure a best fit. I think help your timetabler to think about ways that they can save it. So can they always partner you up with the same 1 or 2 teachers if you're working part-time? So are you able to share classes with the same person, because that reduces kind of communication time between people. The other thing to do is, if somebody's not working the whole of the week, is to maybe give them 2 or 3 Year 8 classes. So in terms of planning, they're kind of planning similar content. So they're not kind of given a piece of every year group, but only 1 lesson with each of those year groups. So think about how you can kind of help with that. With the split classes, we always put this in because, again, the semantics really don't help. So talking about a split class seems to kind of get people concerned, and that's parents, teachers, not students ordinarily. And we're yet to find any research. We actually did a conference for Teach for All, which is kind of global organisation, and I did put a call out to say, you know, is there any academic research that anyone can give that will show that having a split class is detrimental to the outcomes of the pupils? And I haven't heard it back from anyone, so I'm going to say not only nationally but internationally there isn't really a reason to not share classes. So firstly, use the language of STAIR classes, find out what the stigma is and address it. So we all have kind of internal biases, and in the school that I'm working in, we now have like a specific process. So if you're sharing a class, there's a kind of journaling element. So it's like, what am I excited about sharing this class with this teacher? What am I worried about? You know, is it that they're more experienced than me? Am I worried that the students are going to behave in a different way when they're with them than with me? Am I worried about, you know, teaching that particular element of the course? Whatever it is, having a bit of journaling in advance, talking about it, making sure that you know when your communication is going to take place, and having a sort of formal process of how the share is going to take place at the foundation, at the beginning, with an understanding that there's probably going to be more communication right at the start, and then eventually it's going to end up being much more of a kind of collaborative process, and it's going to end up being going from, you know, very kind of possibly sort of 20-minute meeting about how you're doing the handover to a sort of 2-minute conversation about how wonderful those students are, about pedagogy, about how you're supporting those students. And I've put a thing about accountability. So often there's the reason why people seem to be against split classes. It comes down to wanting accountability for Year 11 particularly, and yet we don't seem to be particularly concerned about having split classes in Year 7. Arguably Year 7, they've just come from Year 6 where they had a maximum of 2-3 adults in their lives, and then their classes are split, so they've jumped up to maybe 10 teachers, but those subjects are split because Year 7 aren't deemed as sort of important, or we don't need to be as accountable for them, and suddenly they're sort of faced with, you know, 16 or 17 different adults. Arguably our Year 11 students would be able to cope with that split a lot better. They know the staff by then, you know, and the course, you know, geography is human geography or physical geography, English is language or literature. The course can be split up between 2 teachers who know the course very well. So think about why it is that the school might be not particularly pro split classes, and try and sort of negotiate that through. Emma, your hand is up. Do you want to have a quick share?
Yeah, I often come at this as well. My other head was ITT lead in our school, so sort of thinking about the way that we're supporting trainees, especially in that 5 years when they're really at risk of attrition. And one of the ways that shared classes can be a real bonus actually is when you pair up in an experienced practitioner with a less experienced practitioner. So even before I was part-time, we had part-time members of staff in our department who were ECTs, and they would often get paired with me to provide them with sort of ongoing mentoring as they came into their 3rd and 4th year of teaching. And actually that meant that because there was that touch point with the lead practitioner within the department across maybe 2 or 3 less experienced members of staff, because we were sharing different classes, it meant that our teaching and learning across the whole department, our joint planning, our approaches to marking, the way that I was able to reduce their workload by saying, what on earth are you doing? That's a waste of time. We don't have time for that now, was really helpful for the student outcomes across the whole department. So it was actually a really positive thing. I think one of the things often doesn't get considered there is real sort of details of the logistics. Right now, are they in Miss Shepherd's classroom? Are they in Miss Goodman's classroom? So sort of thinking about routines, it's really important with shared.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really kind of conscious of time, so I don't want to take too much more time, except to say that often a barriers that people or SLT will talk about there not being a precedent. I don't think that that can be an argument anymore. We as an organisation now have an example, like at least one example of every role being done flexibly. And I just did a lovely interview with 2 co-head teachers who began the co-headship because it was kind of logistical, but they are so sold on the benefits of it in terms of CPD, in terms of personal challenge, that they are now, you know, convinced that it is, you know, the best way of being a head teacher in a role that's sort of so full of responsibility. And they're real advocates for that element of flexibility, particularly in that role. So if you're looking for precedent, or if you need some examples, then do come to us or to the MTP2 project, because that definitely shouldn't be a barrier to not trying. It may also be that the barriers are, well, not in our kind of school or not in our school. We know that the biggest, you know, one of the biggest impacts in London in terms of improvement for education was putting schools into families, so kind of looking at their intake. So we do have that kind of data from the teachers who are working flexibly. So if you know it's not just the role, but it's also this context, then be specific about what you need, and we can make sure that we're getting an example of somebody who's working flexibly in the same kind of context as you. So precedent absolutely shouldn't be a barrier. These are the co-head teachers that I was talking about, and that the quote from Vicky is like absolutely sort of says everything that needs to be said. You know, they're really advocating it as a model for good leadership. What I was going to put on here, but I think that we've covered in our individual sessions, so this is just for if you're accessing it remotely or like at a different time, was to give some examples of the kind of scenarios that you might need to come up with. So these are like genuine things that people have come to us with, and so one of the best things that you can do going with your flexible request is to give some options in terms of how you could work that. So I'll you know, people who are watching this later will be able to pause that and kind of take a look at it. This is another kind of example. So again, coming with options, there's so many different ways of finding a way of kind of managing the flexibility that's requested with whilst also kind of supporting the organisation. And so, you know, the final bit of advice really is to make sure, you know, you'll have thought about this more than anyone. You are more equipped probably to talk about the ins and outs of your role, the requirements, like how things might be divvied up, if that's necessary, what it is specifically about the type of flexibility that you're looking for that will have such an impact on the children that you teach. So do come solutions focused and make sure that you've kind of got more than one option. Be flexible in your solutions, even to the point of kind of, you know, rather than just saying I just want to work 0.6, you know, what about between 0.6 and 0.8, so you can kind of be really flexible with the timetable. Think about what you're prepared to compromise on, and then on things that you're really not. So once you're clear on your reason for it, it'll become quite clear which things you can and cannot accept. And then, you know, as we've gone all the way through, so anticipate what those barriers are. And the more open the communication is in your organisation, the more of those informal conversations you will have had in advance. And so you'll be able to anticipate those barriers and concerns before you do. So the next task, if you're watching this after the event, is to think about what are your 3 options, or 3 or 4 options, so that when you go to that meeting or when you're having that kind of formal process, you're able to be really, really clear about those. I think I've already said those things. I don't want to kind of go over it. So these are just like other really useful resources. So we have a book coming out in March, which obviously covers a lot of what I've said today. Mandy Coulter is going to be doing another talk for Pioneer. She has been the head of HR for United Learning. She's won kind of HR awards. She's a kind of wonderful person to have in education, in HR, and kind of pushing that that role, because often, particularly in smaller schools, we maybe haven't had somebody with HR experience, and sort of opening that up and looking at what's happening in other sectors, and helping leaders to see the value of the people in an organisation is really important. And the Women Ed book has a chapter in it about flexible working, but and in general, you know, it's just like an excellent read. These are our kind of sister partner organisations. So MTPT, Emma's obviously been here all day. The Shared Headship Network are working on very specific type of flexibility, Women Ed and Diverse Ed, and then the Global Equality Collective. So that's everything from me. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm going to hand back to Antonia.
Thank you very much, Lucy and Emma. Really delighted to have you here. For Pioneer, our whole flexible working journey started about 3 years ago, I think it was now-ish. Coming up to that, isn't it, Lucy? With Lucy and Lindsay, you know, helping us to take those first steps. And I think what's been really useful tonight is for those people who are thinking about requesting it to understand all of the pushes and pulls that are involved for everybody in that process. So to go in prepared and ready and with a solution focused approach. And you've provided a huge wealth of ideas and insights into that. So thank you very much, Lucy and Emma. Really appreciate your time here. So the next session that we're going to have is around flexible hiring. So please encourage the people in your schools to attend that event so that we can make sure that we are getting a fantastic pool of talent in all of our schools as a result of offering flexibility. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, Lucy. And thank you very much, everybody that's come along this evening. Hope it was useful for you. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a good evening.